All right, so I'd like to thank everyone for being with us today. My name is Annie Newton, and I am the Program and Development Director at the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough. And I'd like to welcome everyone who's joined us today to our annual Lunch and Learns. We do this every year as a kind of summer series of summer programs that focuses on different aspects of history in Hillsborough. This summer, our focus is the Burwell School and the wonderful work and research they've done on this book. I don't know if you can see it. It is titled Antebellum Hillsborough, Slavery and Enslaved and Free People of Color Who Worked at the Burwell School, 1837 to 1857. And the whole program series, starting with today, is going to highlight the work and the wonderful research that they did in this book. This book is for sale at the Burwell School. You can call them or you can go in person to purchase the book. It's got wonderful, wonderful detailed information, maps and statistics and stuff like that. Today, Steve Peck and Janie Morris are joining us today to talk about slavery in Hillsborough and what some of that experience looked like at the Burwell School. And they're going to kick us off for the rest of this series throughout the summer. And as you all know, you can sign up for the rest of those programs on Eventbrite, which I will talk about kind of at the end of our session today. Today, because we have two speakers, we're going to go a little bit over an hour. So it should be about 80 to 90 minutes. If you have any questions throughout the talk, if you look at the bottom here, I know most of you are probably familiar with Zoom at this point, but if you look at the bottom here on your screen, there's a button here that says Q&A. If you click on that, you can type in a question. I will be monitoring those throughout the talk. And so if you do have any questions, even if there's something where you can't hear very well, or you had a question about, something specific that the speaker has said, please type it in there. And again, I will monitor it and make sure those questions are answered immediately. The rest of those questions we will get to at the end of the session. So if you have something you're thinking about while they're presenting, go ahead and type it in and we will answer those. We'll get to those at the end of both of our speakers. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Steve. Steve is going to kick us off and then Janie's going to talk and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So Steve Peck is very knowledgeable about the local history of Hillsborough and has served on several local historic commissions. Those include the Orange County Preservation Commission and the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough. He has written and led tours, including the St. Matthew's Churchyard, Old Town Cemetery, the Revolution in Hillsborough, and the Civil War in Hillsborough. Before he became a member of the Historic Hillsborough Commission, he was a docent at Burwell School and gave many tours and lectures about the site. Since becoming a Burwell Commissioner, he has served on several committees and is a past chair of the Historic Hillsborough Commission. Janie Morris grew up in Hillsborough, so she is from here, and is a retired Duke University librarian. She has been a member of the Historic Hillsborough Commission for several years and a longtime member of the Burwell School Research Committee. She is a lifelong student of history and is excited to share her knowledge of what happened at Burwell and how that fits into the Hillsborough of history and beyond. Like I said, throughout the presentations, if you have any questions that can be about anything in terms of history questions, or if you have questions about the book or the research process, please don't hesitate to ask. We'll get to most of those again at the end of the sessions. But if there's anything kind of urgent in terms of, sound cut out, or you wanted to know, what did you just say? Something like that, I'll be monitoring it throughout. And so I can jump in at any time and help answer those questions. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Steve. Janie and I are going to turn off our audio and our video, and then we'll be back. Steve, it's all you.
Thank you, Annie. I appreciate that. I'm playing around with a background here. I realized when I borrow the background, I don't have shoulders. So I started doing that. I'm going to thank the Alliance for the opportunity to speak with you all today, and also for the great work the Alliance does. And very proud to be a board member of the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough. Obviously, I worked a great deal with Burwell School. I realized not long ago that, God, it's going to be 10, 12 years that I've been working with Burwell and Hillsborough local history. And I've written this and thought a great deal about it. I want to begin talking today because with a quote from a founding father, which is like, open your hymnals, folks. But John Adams said something that I truly think is true if you start to study and think and read about history. He said, the longer I live, the more I read, the more patiently I think, and the more anxiously I inquire, the less I seem to know. I think history is like that, in that there's always more to find out. I don't consider myself an authority on anything. I consider myself very curious. Certainly, if you have things to add to it, or if you want to inquire with me after the presentation, I'm glad to talk to you. History is a mosaic. You are never perfect mosaic. I'm enthralled by history. I am enthusiastic about learning about history. I do not love history. I used to think that I did. I think I actually said that, and I hear people say I love history. But if you think about the day's topic, slavery in antebellum, Hillsborough, and Orange County, this is a time when the great shadow was cast across our country, and it is impossible to love some of this history. And all of us have some truths to tell. As a resolute old Southern white man, I'm not woke. I think I had the same opinions you hear me speak about today for the past 20 years, but they're heartfelt. Hillsborough is great beauty. Orange County is a very beautiful place. There are over 100 buildings that are 18th, 19th century buildings in the historic district and just beyond. It's easy to be in love with the beauty of the place, but forget the history. Who built those houses? How were they maintained? How were they staffed? What wealth built them? With that, I'll begin my presentation, and I'll share a PowerPoint. I hope I didn't bore you too much with maps and the like, but I hope it makes a point, or makes the points. And there we are. Slavery and in antebellum, Hillsborough, and North Orange County. And what I'm saying here is that slavery built, a society was built on that. Annie has already showed you a copy of this book that we put together in 2019 on slaves who built, worked, and maintained Burwell School. The names on the book are very interesting in that if you think about it, in Virginia, they have a project which is called The Unknown, and making the unknown known. And in many ways, that's what we've done. We've acknowledged these people, and they're unknown no more. And I hope it's a value to not only African American, indigenous society to have these names known, so families can begin to piece together their own history, but also for white society to look at it that way. Burwell School was a school for white girls for 20 years. But the Burwells owned 11 slaves, and the Burwells, as enslavers, were not the greatest of people. But then again, they lived in a society when being a, quote, good slave owner meant you could still buy and sell human beings. This book, it was community involvement of the whole community, put together with a variety of articles that people wrote and researched, and copies of this are still available. If you choose to, if you'd like to get a copy, we sort of get it. I will make some references to it throughout talking to you. This is North Carolina in the antebellum period, which roughly is like 1810 to 1860. Antebellum is Greek, I believe, for are a derivative from Greek and meaning before the war. And of course, the war we're talking about is the American Civil War. You see Orange County here in the middle, quite larger than it is today. In the early days, it included all of Person County, all of Caswell, part of Guilford, part of Randolph, part of Chatham, and part of Wake. There was no Durham County, as you can see. It was a county formed somewhat late in our country's history, but one that became very important in terms of settling the back country, as it was called. This is moving along, showing you the slave population in 1830. What's important about this map, and I hope you can read this, is that eight counties at that point in 1830 were majority enslaved. Many more were almost at parity, 40 to 50%. Orange County, as you see here, was the county that was a third enslaved. And that would hold true throughout the antebellum period. This is 1860. And again, at this point, you'll see that 13 counties in the state at that point were a majority African-American or enslaved. Orange County, once again, in that 25 to 50%, a broad number, but actually Orange was about 33, almost exactly the state average, 33% enslaved. This is North Carolina today and Orange County here. We'll talk a little bit about what happened to Orange County and the creation of Durham and Alamance as we go along. This is an interesting way to think about Orange County in the 1850s. And it comes from a book called, that we'll get to a little later, but it shows you the neighborhoods in Orange County. And Orange County at this point would have been without, in 1850, would have been, Alamance would have been divided off from it in 1849. So this was before Durham County. And if you go to the next slide, you get an idea. Here's the division line, and that is Durham County. And that was 1881. So there was no Durham in that period. If you back up to this, I can talk to you a little bit about Orange County at its inception. Let me go here. Let me go back here. And going all the way back to the beginning here. As I said, Orange County was quite large when it was first formed in 1754. By 1758, there was a courthouse, the first courthouse erected in Hillsborough. It would be hacked off, broken up. By 1800, Chatham had been formed, Person County had been formed, and Caswell. The backcountry shaped that as people came from the north, from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and other states in the north to settle in what was basically unsettled land. North Carolina being defined by its coastline. South Carolina and Virginia both had great coasts. We did not, making our settlement much more eastern. Now back to Chatham County, back to Orange County. This is an excellent thing about excellent map showing the neighborhoods, and they were extraordinarily important. As Hillsborough was not a very large city, but it was outsized in its importance. And these are the communities, and you see here one of the keys to Orange County not as it lost population through being divided up, one of the problems that Orange County had during the antebellum period was it was late to get the railroad. The Central Railroad came through Hillsborough and Orange County in 1855. Now, when the Burwells left the town, it left in 1857, just prior to the Civil War. But they left the town and they had begun to grow again because the railroad made that possible. The railroad is also really responsible for the creation of Durham Station, which became Durham, and it's 1881 became the county of Durham. And you get this division. A little bit of it made up by Wake County, but most of it was good old Orange County. I'm always amused by people who talk about the antebellum period, make reference to Durham and Durham County. They would, a person in the period would not have known what you were talking about. This comes, the maps I just showed you, showing the neighborhoods in Orange County were part of this book. And if you ever have a chance to take a look at it in the library or buy a copy, this is one of the finest things I've ever read as a local micro history of Orange County in a very specific period of time, 1849 to 1881. The man on here is John Berry. That name may be familiar to you. John Berry was one of the most noted builders in North Carolina. He was also a Hillsborough native. He's taken very, very stolid-looking husband and wife. I think his wife's name was Eliza, but I'm not sure of that. This was taken in the 1850s. We'll mention Berry again as we go along. And then finally, maybe my last chart for a bit, then we'll talk for a little bit. North Carolina and how we stacked up in terms of slave population. Overall, about a third of it were the enslaved. This is the 1860 census. Virginia, obviously the largest in terms of total enslaved population. You also will note on here that South Carolina, Mississippi, let's see if I can get that down. Oh yeah. And several other states were nearly either predominantly enslaved or it was almost 50-50. And you see a number of states in that range, 40% or greater. It made the fear of slave revolt and insurrection a very lively thing in all the minds of white society. This is a very famous map, and I'll go here and start talking very specifically about Hillsborough. This is the earliest known map of Hillsborough, and it was done by, was commissioned by Governor Tryon. That is the courthouse. The grid you recognize is there. That is King Street. That, and I hope you all can see this. That is Margaret Lane. That is Churton. And that would have been Tryon Street. That was the limit of it in 1768. You see here Occoneechee Mountain, the river flowing through. Then you have a map here of 1865 and how the town has changed. Here you have Churton Street, you have King Street, Tryon, Queen, Union. Here's location of right there would be where you would find the Burwell School. It had grown a great deal. You see here the railroad. It had moved mostly westward. The street over here came to be called Cameron, but it bordered Burnside here, St. Matthews, and the William Kane, the Hardscrabble plantation owner. His property was here. The Jones family owned a plantation here. What I think is significant to think about the antebellum period is though the population of Hillsborough remained very small, probably a little less than 1,000, black and white, in 1860, and that was a fairly constant number, growing only slightly from around 800 in 1840. It was like a spokes in a wheel. If you think about Hillsborough being the hub of that wheel, there were plantations that backed up all around it because of rich bottomland of the river and other reasons. Also, there were a number of slave owners like Burnside with Paul Cameron and John, first Ruffin, and then his son-in-law, Paul Cameron, buys his property, Burnside, for an in-town estate. Paul Cameron, of course, owned Stagville and Farintosh, one of the largest plantations in the South in terms of total acreage and also number of slaves. You have William Kane, who owned property also just west of Hillsborough. You had the Jones family, both of which owned hundreds of enslaved people. You had Poplar Hill, Highlands, other plantations that backed up and went out from the town. So one could live in town and have a plantation and or have an estate in town for reasons of educating your family or just being close to a legal center, which of course Hillsborough was that type of place. I'll pause here and I won't throw any more maps at you here, but let's just talk about this. Again, I said there were about 800 people here in 1840. There were a little less than 1,000 in Hillsborough in 1860. The population number for whites, a third of that number would have been white. The population for African Americans is somewhat in debate because slave owner dictated said how many slaves you owned, but you didn't know if those slaves, particularly in the case of Hillsborough, lived in the town or actually were out of town and properties owned by the individual. So the number of African Americans, I think, can perhaps higher, perhaps lower. We can't be sure for that reason. There was in the Hillsborough and in Orange County a short presence of indigenous people, the Saponi Occaneechi Indian tribe. In the antebellum period, they would have been called free people of color or mulattoes. There could be a variety of ways in which they're referred to. They were trapped along with those African Americans who had been emancipated, were free, also free, but not totally. They were trapped between the enslaved and white society, and that often caused them great difficulty. Again, I mentioned that you can't come up with a real estimate of what Hillsborough's population of slaves would be. We do know that it was predominantly women if you look at the records. Although if you owned a business, a cannery, a brickyard, you were a merchant, you might have a predominance of males, male enslaved. Hillsborough was a dominant town in terms of politics. If you take 1840, for instance, both of our U.S. senators are from Hillsborough, Orange County. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would be from Hillsborough, Thomas Ruffin. He would be followed immediately by Frederick Nash, another Hillsborough resident. The congressman from our district, this area, was from Hillsborough. It had an outsized influence on politics. In the law, again, legal, mercantile, religious, educational, and societal leadership. That's what you saw in white society in Hillsborough. Thomas Ruffin, William Graham, both prominent attorneys. Graham would go on to be not only a U.S. senator, but governor, a member of the cabinet, and a candidate for vice president of the United States. Merchants were very important in town as a legal center and a county seat. Hillsborough would have been a place where merchants thrived, and Airmount and William Kirkland are a great example of that. He built a tremendous fortune and a very, very beautiful estate, which you can still visit today. Religious leadership. I know Brooks Grebner will speak to you about St. Matthew's, and I hope about religion generally in Hillsborough. But during this period, a very famous cleric was a man named Moses Curtis. He was a rector at St. Matthew's. And of course, Robert Burwell was the minister of the Presbyterian Church in Hillsborough for most of his years that he was in Hillsborough. Education. Well, we know the Burwell School, but there was also Hillsborough Academy, quite famous in the area and in the state. So you had a society really kind of that revolved around against the spokes of, around the hub of the wheel were turning around Hillsborough in the region and in the state. In 1849, Alamance broke off. That really weakened Orange County politically in the antebellum period because it really dropped population. There was a creation, and that happened because of the news that the railroad was going to be built through here. Graham was founded. Burlington was named as company shops, and that's where the railroad had rail yard in Burlington, which was called company shops at the time. Graham was made out of whole cloth into the county seat. Just a bump in the road, but became the county seat of Alamance County. So Orange was certainly weakened in terms of its political influence, if not its land mass and population. It's important to note, and I think little thought about in some circles, that UNC's presence was always extremely important. In many ways, in the 19th century, Hillsborough was much more important than the university in many ways. Chapel Hill was a village, a small place. And the student body had reached a number of something like 450 in 1860, but had been steadily on the rise. Part of the reason for UNC being in Orange County is the central location in terms of the state, but also because of Hillsborough. Many of the leadership in terms of trustees and donations of land and time and energy was made to the university by Hillsborough folk. And the law in particular was something you could study law with attorneys after leaving UNC, and very often they came to Hillsborough to some of the great legal minds for the time who were there. I guess this is getting right to the heart of our discussion about slavery. And again, I'm trying to just set a table for thinking about where Orange County fit in North Carolina and the South, and also Hillsborough. Chattel slavery and human beings as property, and property in perpetuity. That's where you were with chattel slavery. If you were born a slave, your child would be a slave, his child would be a slave. Very different kind of slavery. that developed for us. And it was systematically just dehumanize people in every way. Slave revolts were feared in the South for generations, and they occurred sporadically throughout the history of the antebellum South. But Nat Turner's in August of 1831 revolt in South eastern Tidewater, Virginia, was by far the most threatening and frightening of the revolts, and it led to a tremendous tightening of the weight of slavery on individuals, on the enslaved, and on, as it turned out, free of color, who were very suspect as being individuals who would potentially lead the enslaved to freedom. This county has done a lot of work in our Register of Deeds. Mark Chilton has done a great job in leadership to look at our slave records and begin to look at and develop a database to give names to the unnamed. If you look back on the laws, going back to the laws that were enacted, I'll jump ahead here one slide and show you something that came out of the Hillsborough Recorder. Hillsborough Recorder was the #1 paper in the Piedmont, antebellum Piedmont, and it was published in Hillsborough. This is announcing in 1831 following an ordinance which prohibits slaves from being on the street after dark and until daylight, because they would be arrested and committed to jail if they did not have a written permission of some sort from their owner. Those kinds of laws predominated Southern society, particularly after Nat Turner's 1831 revolt, as fear of slave revolt grew. There's a famous, not so famous, but one I find quite amusing, actually. Letter written by a man named Alexander Kirkland. And it's written remembering the Christmas time around 1831. And it's written to his sister. And Kirkland says, "Christmas we had, such as it was, all in arms and parading in the street, consequence of a supposed insurrection among the slaves, stirring notions into these poor creatures' heads they would have never had otherwise. They, the blacks, are highly amused and kept up during the holidays an incessant giggling in their sleeves at our fears. It was more than diverting to witness a powerful effect upon them and the powerful effect upon the gentry of our town. The town divided itself into patrol companies, and he, of course, had been impressed into one of those. They met at the Masonic Lodge in Hillsborough, where it was appointed as a general rendezvous place for all the women in case of an actual attack. And your humble servant, William Kirkland, was appointed to the high and mighty office of captain of the night patrol. Nothing occurred during the night distinguished at all, except for fires that were provided by his patrol, because they thought there was something going on. And he goes on to talk about William Bingham, another famous man of the town, being so frightened that he walked backwards because he was afraid someone might hit him in the head. All that's kind of amusing in its own way, but it speaks to the fact that there was a tremendous fear in the community, and patrols, the slave patrols were a thing which occurred all across the South. One moment. Now, if you look at, there are a number of records, and I'll come back to the Freedmen's Bureau marriage records, and really what that's amounting to is that I wanted to mention that because in the period just after the Civil War, for about a year and a half, if a couple, an African American or indigenous couple, would go to the clerk of court, they could declare that they were married for a number of years and that they were married going forward, because slaves were not allowed to marry. Slaves were not allowed to learn to read and write. They were restricted as to movement. But the Freedmen's Bureau records gives us a look at those people who, in fact, were by their own standards and their own common law married. And it's really heartwarming to look at the 900 couples who did that in 1865, 1866, to I think the first part of 1867, actually, who came forward. One couple had been married in Orange County 50 years by their declaration in 1866. They'd been married as slave marriage in 1860. Quite poignant to look at. So there was an effort to get around, if you will, and a belief in getting around some of the incredible laws that were passed. If you take a look at the book we produced at at Burwell that we talked about earlier, the 1839 Bailey map will jump out at you. And it's a section I wrote, and it's a map that was done by memory by a guy who was very young, going to school at Hillsborough Academy in 1838, 1837. His family would move to Hillsborough and live there until roughly 1857. White family, very prominent. But what he did was he made a map and actually told us where people lived, where the buildings were located. If you go back and look at that map, the Bailey map, what struck me as I went back through the census records of 1840 was there were slaves all around. Some free of color in Hillsborough, but a huge number of enslaved everywhere. And I think if you were a white inhabitant of Hillsborough in 1840 in the middle of the antebellum period, you might have looked out of the house and not even seen the slaves. If you were enslaved yourself or a person of color, that may have been all you saw, was the others who were all around you. Without belaboring it too much, and I'll go into a little of it.
Steve, just so you know, you have about a few more minutes, then we're going to jump to Janie.
Okay, sure. Slavery built Hillsborough, Orange County, and the university. And I'm going to. The Hillsborough Recorder documents slavery and the consequence of it. If you go to here, you look at buildings. I'll go just show you two buildings that I think are very significant. This is Dickerson AME Church. Originally, this was the courthouse in Courthouse Square. It was drug up to its current location in 1845, January of 1845. It's the most historically significant building in Hillsborough, and the reason is this. For 1790 to 84, it was the third courthouse. Slaves would have been sold and rented on the front of the steps of this now church. But it would also serve as a church for the Baptists who bought the building and drug it up there. And before they built their church, it would have been a church where the Methodists and Presbyterians also went before they built their churches. Then it became a freedmen's school in 1866, and then later a church. Again, irony of ironies, it's likely that some of the members of AME Church might very well have been rented on or seen their relatives or others rented and or sold as part of an estate on the steps of this church. Another one, here's the old, quote, courthouse. It replaced that one, the fourth courthouse, which is the one that's still there. It's a place the enslaved feared because every year in January, slaves were rented out on those steps. Also, estates were broken up on that step, on those steps. They could not be a part of it. They could not have any justice here. Final irony is that the interior of this building was likely built by, this building was erected by John Berry, but his lead carpenter, who likely did all the finish work inside, was a man named Joe Nichols, an African-American slave man. 13th century ended, 13th Amendment, ended slavery. This is an interesting artifact in the Coachman's Cottage in Hillsborough, part of Burnside plantation. Paul Cameron, Thomas Ruffin owned it, and Paul Cameron. That is, people think that may have been etched in that stone by an enslaved person, remarking that on the December 4th, North Carolina ratified the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And that it took, maybe it was the next day before this person heard about it. Again, there are many points to go through in thinking about what happened after slavery. But I think the most important of which is that the African Americans began to establish their own communities, their own churches. They sought an education, and they began to struggle for representation and full citizenship. I've gone over, so I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Steve. Janie, we're going to jump to you. Steve, that was wonderful and extraordinarily informative. And we'll come back. Janie, now it's your turn. Steve, if you want to turn off your audio and your video, and then after Janie, we're all going to turn on our cameras and we will answer questions.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you so much, Annie, and thank you, Steve, for that very informative, interesting and insights into Orange County. And I also want to thank the Alliance for collaborating with the Burwell School Historic Site for this series of 5 Lunch and Learn. So thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to start then. When Reverend Robert Burwell, his wife, Margaret Anna, and their 2 children moved to Hillsborough in 1835, they brought Lizzie Hobbs with them from Virginia. She was one of the enslaved people held by the Burwell family in Virginia that came to work in Hillsborough. Elizabeth Cobbs Keckley, as she became known, is the most well-known person to live in the Burwell School. She was born into slavery in the household of Colonel Armistead Burwell in Dinwiddie County, Virginia. In 1831, Colonel Burwell lent Lizzie to his eldest son, Robert Burwell, upon his marriage to Margaret Anna Robinson. In 1835, the 17-year-old arrived in Hillsborough with the Burwell family. She, unlike many enslaved persons, could read and write. She also had a skill. She was an excellent seamstress. In her memoir published in 1868, Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, Elizabeth writes of her time in Hillsborough, where she spent 6 years in the Burwell household. Elizabeth wrote the family practiced the closest economy, and she did the work of 3 servants. And yet I was scolded and regarded with distrust. She suffered beatings. She was forced into a relationship with a local man, Alexander Kirkland, that produced a son named George Kirkland. It is believed that Elizabeth was the half-sister of Reverend Robert Burwell, having had the same father. The only reference we have to this was a conversation that she had late in her mother's life, in which she was told that Colonel Armistead Burwell was her father. This conversation is recorded in the book They Knew Lincoln, written by John Washington in 1942. Mrs. Keckley did not identify Colonel Armistead Burwell as her father in Behind the Scenes, and it may be that she did not learn from her mother at that time that he was her father. In 1842, Elizabeth and her young son George returned to Virginia to the household of the Reverend Burwell's younger sister, Anna Burwell Garland, and her husband, Hugh A. Garland. In 1847, the Garland family moved to St. Louis, Missouri, where Elizabeth Hobbs married James Keckley, a man who represented himself as free, but in fact, he was a runaway enslaved man. He and Mrs. Keckley soon parted ways. The Garlands hired Mrs. Keckley out as a seamstress to provide income for the family. She gained the reputation as prompt, reliable, and skilled, and soon reached the level of modiste, which is a designer of the most intricate and well-fit gowns. In 1855, Mrs. Keckley's patrons loaned her $1,200 to purchase her freedom and that of her son, George Kirkland, from the Garland family. In 1860, Mrs. Keckley established her own dressmaking business, first in Baltimore and later in Washington, D.C. As a skilled seamstress, she acquired a clientele of the wives of prominent politicians and businessmen, including Varina Howell Davis, wife of Jefferson Davis, and First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. Mrs. Keckley's relationship with Mary Todd Lincoln evolved into more than just that of a dressmaker and her client. She served as Mrs. Lincoln's confidant, and in the First Lady's own words, her best friend. In 1861, her son George died fighting for the Union during the Civil War, having enlisted as a white man under the name George Kirkland, assuming the last name of his birth father, Alexander Kirkland. Mrs. Keckley later taught in the Department of Sewing and Domestic Science Arts at Wilberforce University in Ohio. She died in Washington, D.C. in 1907 at the age of 88. In addition to her memoir, other writings and stories have been written about Mrs. Keckley, including the work by historian Dr. Jennifer Fleischner titled Mrs. Lincoln and Mrs. Keckley. Mrs. Keckley is remembered by a historical marker near the Burwell School historic site. Also, a room at Burwell contains a replica of one of the dresses made by Keckley for Mrs. Lincoln, created by talented seamstress and former Burwell commissioner, Karen DeSombre. We also have a copy of the first edition of Mrs. Keckley's memoir, Behind the Scenes, on display. And I hope if some of you on the call have not done so already, I hope you will visit the Burwell School and take a tour of the entire school, including the room that we have devoted, or parts of it devoted to Elizabeth Keckley. My colleague on the Lunch and Learn, Steve Peck, has presented numerous and enlightening lectures on the life of Mrs. Keckley. What a remarkable woman. We are fortunate to have so many sources relating to her life and work. But what about the other enslaved and free people of color who worked at the Burwell School? They left no written records. Who were they? What tasks did they have? What we know about them primarily comes from Anna Burwell's diaries and letters. By studying them, we have identified more than 40 enslaved and free people of color who lived and or worked at the Burwell School while it was in operation from 1837 to 1857. However, since we have only 3 years of Anna Burwell's diaries, the list is by no means inclusive of everyone who worked there. In her writings, Anna Burwell did not use the term slave, but always called enslaved people servants, and often gave the last name of free people of color. It is important to note that we only know of them from the enslaver's point of view. As has been mentioned, when Reverend Robert Burwell, his wife Margaret Anna, and their 2 children moved to Hillsborough in 1835, they brought Lizzie Hobbs with them from Virginia. Over time, others from the large number of enslaved people held by the Burwell family in Virginia also came to Hillsborough to work at Burwell, including Mary Ann, Lucy, Aunt Judy, Hannah, Philip, and Alfred. In addition, the Burwells rented other slaves from nearby households and also hired free people of color to do specific jobs. The 1840 federal census records 6 enslaved people living with the Burwells in Hillsborough, 2 males, of whom one was under 10 years old and the other between 10 and 24 years old, and 4 females, of whom one was under 10, 2 were between 10 and 24 years old, and 1 was between 24 and 26 years old. The 1850 census records the Burwells as owning 11 slaves. Although not every prominent family viewed slavery the same, the prevailing attitude was that a slave, like a woman, should know and adhere to a place in life subservient to the white man who was in control. Every December, financial entries in Anna Burwell's diaries show that the Burwells followed the common practice of renting slaves. The rent they paid went to the slaveholders. They paid daily wages to the free people of color. The enslaved workers were provided with food and clothing, but no wages. The Burwells rented people from the Strudwick, Weld, Long, and Hill households to cook, wash, work the garden, drive the buggy, clean the house, light fires, sew, wait tables, watch children, and do maintenance work on the house and property. In an 1856 letter to her daughter Fanny, Anna Burwell writes that they rented the enslaved man Bob for $130 for the year. Reverend Job Berry was enslaved and was a day laborer who worked for the Burwells, and I believe this was in 1855. She lists him as gardening. The Burwells also hired free people of color to do specific jobs, notably Eliza Chavis, who was a laundress, and Umstead Mayo, who was a handyman. There were houses or outbuildings on the Burwell property where the enslaved lived, and there was a kitchen. We think there was a kitchen outside the main house, which included a room that most likely the enslaved Hannah lived, and she was a cook for the Burwells. Other enslaved and free workers lived in the neighborhood, and walked to work to start fires, draw water, and feed the livestock, among other tasks. There was also a separate outbuilding that was used as a laundry. We believe that there was a separate one used as a laundry, which had fire and water. Eliza Chavis, however, did not live at the Burwell School. In the 1850 federal census, she is listed as living in the boarding house of Andrew C. Murdoch. She is age 40 and is listed as a mulatto. The household also includes Leroy Chavis, 10, a mulatto, and Martin Chavis, age 6 months, who is a mulatto. And interestingly enough, Martin Chavis was a little girl. Unlike some free people of color who moved out of the Hillsborough community, Eliza Chavis and her descendants remained in Hillsborough. Both Chavis and Strudwick family lore claim each other as cousins. Eliza Chavis was related by marriage to the Payne family, which included Reverend Billy Payne, a founder of Dickerson Chapel AME Church and Payne's Chapel AME Church. Reverend Robert Burwell was present in the AME congregation in Charlotte when Reverend Joe Berry and Reverend Billy Payne were ordained. Umstead Mayo was a free Black man born in Orange County in 1829. In the July 29, 1850 federal census for Hillsborough, he is recorded as age 21, laborer, living in the household of James Valentine. And James Valentine, age 28, was a barber. Also in the household, and they were all free Black persons, were Susan Valentine, age 30, Manuel Strudwick, age 80, a shoemaker, Jack Strudwick, age 20, a laborer, and Eliza Mayo, age 15. Anna Burwell mentions that work done by Umstead Mayo at the Burwell household in 1855 included planting onions and potatoes, sowing lettuce, and pumping off water from the muddy well. The Burwell household was plagued by muddy water in the well, and on a number of occasions, Mrs. Burwell had the well cleaned. There are at least 3 well sites on the Burwell property today. The Burwells left Hillsborough in 1857 to work at the Presbyterian Female Academy in Charlotte. It's now called Queen's University of Charlotte. The 1860 census shows that Umstead Mayo was a member of the Burwell household in Charlotte. After Mrs. Burwell's death at 61 in 1871, Reverend Robert Burwell and his son John assumed ownership of Peace Institute, a girls' school, which now is William Peace University in Raleigh, North Carolina. Umstead Mayo, however, remained in Charlotte, where he was employed by the city of Charlotte. He owned property and, according to his obituary, was wealthy. Reverend Joe Berry was the first pastor of Hillsborough's first church for people of color, Dickerson Chapel AME Church, which he helped organize. He was preaching and serving as a minister in the 1850s at a time when Black congregations were prohibited by the 1835 North Carolina legislators' restrictive policies. And as we've learned from Steve, these restrictive policies went into effect after the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia in August 1835, when slave owners in Orange County and all of North Carolina became fearful of people of color. After the Civil War, the AME denomination arrived in North Carolina, and Joe Berry was licensed by the AME Conference as a local pastor, which formalized the congregational identity and his ministerial status that had actually existed informally in the antebellum period. In 1865, Joe Berry spearheaded the formation of the Freemen's School in Hillsborough. Throughout her diaries and letters, Anna Burwell laments that she cannot keep the servants in their place. When she was chided by her husband for not having the house in order, she wrote, "I do not know what to do. I feel like giving up." Hannah was a constant worry for Anna Burwell. She came from Virginia with her sister Lucy and became the cook for the Burwells. She lived with Philip. They fought. Philip was sent away and then consented to be returned. Anna Burwell mentions Hannah 14 times in the diaries and letters from 1846 to 1856. Her complaints often center around Hannah's consumption of alcohol. In diary entries in 1855, Anna Burwell writes, "Twice I gave way to impatience of temper, once to Kelly and once to Mary Ann." And another entry, "Gave way to fretfulness to Kelly's breaking Jenny's pretty mug." In a December 22nd, 1855 letter to her daughter Fanny, Anna Burwell writes that the sister of Maria, and Maria was an enslaved person at the Burwell household, is marrying Dolphus, and he was an enslaved person at the Whitted household, and that Maria, Anne, and Primus was enslaved by Edmund Strudwick, but he worked for the Burwell family also in 1855. Anyhow, they are to attend the wedding. They're attend Maria's sister. And and Reverend Robert Burwell loaned the horse and buggy for Primus to drive, Primus. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. But anyhow, Reverend Robert Burwell loaned the horse and buggy to Primus to drive Maria and Anne to the wedding. Mrs. Burwell says that Mary Ann, and she was an enslaved person in the Burwell household, made a headdress of Burma chicken feathers for Maria to wear, and that Maria looped the sleeves of her dress with blue ribbon. From research previously conducted by historian Dr. Mary Claire Engstrom, we learned that when Reverend Burwell purchased the property on which their home and school were located from the local Presbyterian church, he offered, and I am quoting here, his Negro girl, Mary Ann, and her 4 children with all her future increases, and also the Negro girl Ann and her increases, if she shall ever have any, as sureties in order to buy this property. The deed of trust is dated July 16, 1850. In 1855, a series of events led the Burwells to become increasingly dissatisfied with their life in Hillsborough, culminating in their move to Charlotte in 1857. On March 13, 1855, Anna recorded that she and Reverend Burwell are ill, and that money matters are at the bottom of all the trouble. She recorded one illness after another in February, March, April, and May among family, the enslaved, and the students. For a week or more at a time, the sick enslaved were kept from their work. And of course, when that happened, it fell to Mrs. Burwell to do, in addition to her teaching duties, sewing, cooking, household maintenance, and visiting the sick of parish, to do the work. The next year brought the tragic death of the Burwell's daughter, Fanny. When in 1857, Reverend Burwell was offered a position as head of the New Charlotte Female Academy, which is now Queen's University of Charlotte, the steady income and promise of starting a happier life persuaded the Burwells to accept. They moved to Charlotte, where their household included 6 enslaved people, identified in the 1860 federal slave census as 3 women aged 45, 40, and 35, 1 girl aged 12, 1 man aged 18, and one boy aged 10. We do not know the names of these people, but presumably one of them was Mary Ann, who is mentioned in Anna Burwell's letters and diaries in 1846 and 1855, when the family still lived in Hillsborough. In 2020, the Queen's University of Charlotte's Board of Trustees voted to rename the university's main administration building on the campus from Burwell Hall, which was built and named in 1914, to Queen's Hall, after a task force appointed by the university's president investigated their namesake's ties to slavery. And there is much history yet to be researched and written. For instance, some of the Burwell students also brought enslaved people to help them with their everyday activities. What were they like? We don't know. Descendants of the people who worked at the Burwell School still live in Hillsborough, and it is to much of the credit for this report, which I've assembled from our task force report, that we have learned a lot of information. And as Steve has just mentioned, documentation in the Orange County Register of Deeds office supplies a story of land ownership, marriages, and family names. Notices in the local newspaper and church records provide information about the life of these families in the years since 1857. Thank you very much. And that's the end of my presentation. And again, thanks to Annie and Steve and the Alliance for giving us this opportunity to present this series of Lunch and Learns. I hope you'll all sign up for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Janie. Like Steve, that was very informative. Good. I was gonna say, Steve, if you want to turn your camera on, we're going to move to questions. So again, if you have any questions, write them down here in the Q&A. We've got 3 questions so far. One of them has already been answered, which was where that original that neighborhood map was from, and that was in the Kinzer book. For everyone who has attended today, I'm going to send an email out. I'll send an email of the recording from today, and I'll include the title of that book. It is a little bit hard to find. I've been looking for it, but there are some copies out there on various sites. So the next question is, what year did Hillsborough become the county seat?
I'll take that. Hillsborough has always been the county seat. In 1754, Colonial Governor William Tryon, in an effort to bring good government, I guess would be the word, to the Piedmont area, which is rapidly growing with migration, chartered Orange County and Hillsborough. It wasn't really until 1758 when we know the first courthouse appears in the records, and was probably finished that year. Might be the first time that Hillsborough really officially became a town. It went through some name changes in there. There was an early courthouse or court meeting, I think, in Haw River. But really, Hillsborough has been the county seat of Orange County forever and a day. And many people don't realize that. I've also, people from afar don't really understand that Hillsborough, that Chapel Hill is not its own county seat. Part of the growth of the university that the dog now wags the tail. It used to be that Hillsborough was the dog wagging the tail of the university. That isn't the case in university internationally and nationally. Far outstrips it.
The next question, thank you, Steve. The next question is, do we know if the free people of color, as with Eliza Chavis, who are noted as living in other houses, were they living in the households of other free people of color?
I will try to answer that one. I did mention that in my talk that Eliza Chavis was living, let me see if I can find it in my notes. I believe she was living with the Murdoch family. Let me see.
While you're looking for that, Janie, do we know if there are other people who are living with free people of color in Hillsborough who worked at Burwell?
I'm not sure. I'm
Yeah.
really not sure.
Yeah.
I would volunteer that if you have access to Ancestry and or census records, you can easily scroll through them yourself, because free people of color will be listed in the census by name, and you can match up individuals.
Yeah.
So that is something you can do.
Right. The census records are just invaluable for giving us just a peek, just a little look into the ages, were they mulatto, were they Black? I mean, thank goodness for those census records, because that has, been able to tell us quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, we found, obviously the Alliance is located in the Alexander House, and we found a lot of information that way too. I will note, for those of you who are using the census records, make sure you know to look in the slave schedules. So enslaved people would not have been listed in the census, because we know that they were not counted as full people. They're counted as 3/5. And so they would be located in the slave schedules. And that you can find, the Library of Congress has that. If you belong to Ancestry, that also has access to all of that. And those are constantly being updated. It does make it, and I was going to ask you all, if you could talk a little bit about what some of the difficulties with your research, because, this information is hard to find. And I was hoping you all could talk a little bit about what were some things that were challenging while the research committee worked on this book, because this is a lot of information in here. And so, what were some of the challenges that you all faced in trying to gather this information? And is there still stuff that you are looking to find?
Well, as I mentioned toward the end of my talk, we know that some of the students, the Burwell students, brought people with them who were enslaved, but they came to sort of help the girls, the students at the school. We don't know a whole lot about them. We don't know a lot, but we know that they did come with some people to help them. And well, some of the letters and diaries, I guess most of them, of Anna Burwell has been transcribed. And so that has been helpful, because it's easier, of course, to read transcriptions than it is to read 19th century handwriting. So, but that can be really challenging if you're trying to decipher a 19th century letter. We wish we knew more. And we only have 3 years, I believe it's 3 years of Anna Burwell's diaries. Well, we were just sure that there are more people of color who we just know there are more. And so we've just, and I'm not sure how we can find any more if that's what we have. And only about 11 years of letters. Anna Burwell's letters. So there's so much that we don't know. And I think that's the story, I guess, probably any historian who's done serious work would tell you, you just have to go with what you have. Yeah. You can kind of interpret, but I think in a way that's questionable too. We have to go with what we can state. And that's what I tried to do in my talk, is just try to say what we know. And and Steve, you might be able to speak to this a little bit more. We know there were buildings on the Burwell property besides what we have now, but we don't really know how many, but we know there was some. And for instance, in the 19th century, and I guess probably before then, and certainly in the early 20th century, the kitchens were usually separate from the main house, because you were so afraid there would be a fire and destroy the main house also. So we're pretty sure there was a separate building where probably the cook stayed. Steve, were you going to say something?
Well, I was going to make a comment about research, and I'll give you an example of something I was involved in. We know that there was a man named Joe Nichols who worked for for John Barry. We know that he was his master carpenter because Barry calls him such in Gary's will in 1857, before freedom came, as an incredibly valuable person. As I read snippets here and there about John Barry, I went back to the slave records in Orange County, which Mark Chilton has really, and his folks have done a great job in trying to put together. And I was able to really identify an early purchase of a young boy in the early 1830s. His name was Joe, who was owned by, and I'm going to forget a name here, Nichols, who was the owner of the Carolina Inn, no, the Colonial Inn, then called Orange Hotel, and went through a variety of names. Well, by getting that one snippet, and you can match ages up, and you know that and early in the early 1840s, late 1830s, Nichols renovated the inn. That matches up perfectly when Joe Nichols, who took his master's last name, would have been coming of age as a carpenter. It's likely that he worked on and or helped design the facade of the Colonial Inn. He would be purchased at some point by John Barry. And then a whole host of things began to fall into place as to who was who, if you look at Freedman's records of marriages, because he claimed a marriage to Harriet Strayhorn, who worked at Twin Chimneys across from the Colonial Inn. And then, so we were able to save the Joe Nichols Cemetery, which is just behind Hillsborough, the town offices up on Annex. We were able to save that, and we had a ceremony saving the sign. Many of his relatives came together, many of which did not know they were kin to each other. Because Nichols, after the Civil War, became a leader in the Mars Hill community of African Americans, which formed up around North Churton. So I think today, I guess to sum up that example, today there's if you could, with things like what we've done in Orange County with the Orange County slave records, good census work, an interest in the families in putting together their own geography, their own genealogy. There's a real opportunity to find more of those people. I'd also know, just the final thing, that Joe Nichols is likely the one who did the renovations at Burwell, because that was all frame and wood. When they renovated the house in 1848, he would have been the lead house carpenter. He might have actually come up with the design to change the orientation of the house. And that was only true to us as we thought about that as we approached our 200th anniversary at Burwell. Anyway, example that I think useful to think about.
Yeah.
In terms of your question, Janie, yes, there's no doubt there are other houses. If someone would like to gift us about $30,000 for a ground piercing radar, we can probably identify foundations, because none of that has really been disturbed at Burwell. And so we're waiting on that check, folks.
Anybody want to get out their wallet and write us a check? We'll take it. Well, I did find my notes. Excuse me. I did find my notes about Eliza Chavis. I said she did not live at the Burwell School, and in the 1850 census, She is listed as living in the boarding house of Andrew C. Murdoch. She is age 40 and listed as mulatto, and the household also included other people, including Leroy Chavis, age 10, who was a mulatto, and Martin Chavis, age 6 months, who was a mulatto, and Martin Chavis, I mentioned, was a little girl.
And we don't want to be insulting here because it's very likely Eliza Chavis was indigenous, a Native American, and all of the indigenous people really were lumped together. Many of them did have African American descent, but many were not. I mean, they were Saponi, Occaneechi Indians. We need to be real careful about how do they self-identify? We don't know.
Right. Yeah, that was problematic for me in trying to put these remarks together. We do in the task force report, we talk about people of color, and I don't mean at all to take away anything from the indigenous peoples, but it seemed like people of color seem to be like as good a term as any as we could come up with. And I'm really, that was a problematic for me in preparing these remarks. But I went ahead and the people of color.
I think what's also difficult is that if you were indigenous, if you were American Indian, the state classified you as colored. And so it is very hard to find a lot of those numbers and my dog has something to add, so I apologize for his barking. It is hard to find some of those numbers on if somebody was Black or American Indian, because a lot of them were just, again, lumped by the state as being other. That was their race. And so how do you know? And a lot of this information too, you guys are talking about how a lot of Anna Burwell's journals, you only have a few years of those. You don't have a lot of her letters. You've got, about a decade, it sounds like, of her letters, but think about how long she lived. And, I think about this often, historians only know what has survived. And so a lot of the information that you can, get factual things from are things like the census and things that, the state has kept records on. But a lot of that stuff, there's also a lot of missing gaps there. And so you just don't know, which is, I find that kind of fun about history, because it's, you're putting together kind of this mystery, this puzzle, and piecing it all together. But it does make it really difficult, particularly with people who haven't left records behind because they couldn't read or write, or they weren't allowed the agency of being able to talk for themselves or leave their own mark or leave their own, identifying things. I did have a question, Steve, this is kind of one more for you, but when Orange County was divided, I was looking at some of the statistics in this book here, which has information about Orange County and the population and all of that. When Orange County was divided, how did that impact slavery? Do you know?
I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Well, so if you look at the statistics, you look at it and there's a huge population decrease when Orange County is divided.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so then the percentages of slavery changes. So how does that change when Orange County is divided? Do you know? Were there more slaves in Alamance? Were there more slaves in what then became what we know as
that's a good question.
Yeah, where's most of that population?
When I don't think the percentages changed a lot, because still the largest plantations would have been Farintosh and Stagville. And though that straddled Caswell and what county? Caswell and
Person, maybe?
Person, yes. No, you're right. Person, it straddled Person, Orange, and what other county? Still, with 1,000 slaves, they really kind of skewed the numbers in that direction.
Yeah.
Plus, you had in Hillsborough, you had families that owned. For us, most of Ruffin's slaves would have gone to Alamance, and he had 100. But many of them weren't necessarily gone when they divided up. So, and Kane, the Hardscrabble, had over 100 slaves on St. Mary's Road. That did not divide into Orange to Durham County for a long time. And so I don't think it skewed it that much.
That makes sense. Because you do, I was looking at it and I was like, wow, these I was like, these numbers really changed. And I was like, oh yeah, because they break up the county and it does change the overall statistics of, Black population versus white population.
I'm very interested, maybe Mark will be able to address this when Mark Chilton, when he talks about in North Orange County slave records, to what extent Alamance took records with them from deeds that were for Alamance County. And Alamance has not been as, let's say, forward-thinking about slave records as has Orange. Politically, that's perhaps not as palatable. But I'd like to know.
Chapel Hill is in Orange, so UNC is in Orange County, so that might be some of it.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
I'm also biased because I'm a Tar Heel, so.
And the university, I mean, I didn't even really talk about the fact that the university owned slaves. Yeah. Just like churches own slaves. I mean, they were actually left slaves in the will. And there was a thing in North Carolina that if you died intestate, the university by hook or by crook could in fact secure those surplus slaves as their own. So it was an insidious and continuing thing. One thing I will say again is that another point I'd make about researching slavery and who was what families were affected by that. I think African Americans in particular and indigenous Native American people have a real interest in in the current generation in finding out the answers to those questions. And they're doing a tremendous amount of family work to get back to where you can go to the 1870 census and begin to pick it up. And also things like what Mark Jilton's doing with the deeds here, that's helping a great deal to piece it all together. And you're right, it's like a mosaic. It's not going to be perfect.
Yeah.
You're looking through a glass very darkly.
You are. And it's amazing to me, how much I was a history major in college and then got a master's in history years later. And it's always amazing to me how much has changed, how much more we know now, even from, the not few years, but, from between when I got my various degrees, it's changed a lot. And then you think of, what did we know in 1950? What did we know in 1980? All of that has just changed remarkably of just the information we have access to now. And it's, I can only just hope that we'll know so much more within the decades to come. It is already 1:30. I wanted to say thank you guys so much. This was wonderful. As always, you all were so insightful and just incredibly knowledgeable. We said, the Alliance, thanks everyone for joining us today. Steve and Janie, thank you so much for your time. If anyone in here is if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me, or you can contact Burwell directly and I can pass those questions along. If you enjoyed today, Steve, go ahead.
One more thing, in the back of the book we produced at Burwell is a good bibliography, and we've added to that. If anyone's interested more in that, I certainly, Janie and I can help them at Burwell.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, you can pick this book up at Burwell. It's fascinating. It's got lots of really, really good data and statistics and information in there. If you enjoyed today, the Alliance is doing a class on slavery with Dr. Freddie Parker. We do that every Tuesday night for the month of May. There is another class next Tuesday. You can sign up through our Eventbrite page on eventbrite.com. You can find the Alliance that way. And then our next Lunch and Learn with Burwell is going to be on June 22nd. So I hope everyone can join us for that. Again, Steve and Janie, thank you so, so much. And and thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. I wish we could talk all day, but we got to stay firm to our letting people eat their lunch and then go back to work. So again, thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janie. Thanks, Steve. Have a good one.